Why God does not use man to do his work of judgment in the last days, but becomes flesh and does it himself. Relevant words of God: the work of judgment is God's own work, so it must naturally be carried out by God himself, it cannot be done by man in his stead. Because judgment is the use of the truth to conquer humankind, there is no question that God would still appear in the incarnate image to perform this work among men. That is to say, Christ of the last days shall use the truth to teach people across the world and make all truths known to them. This is God's work of judgment. Christ of the last days uses a variety of truths to teach man, to expose the substance of man, and to dissect the words and deeds of man. These words comprise various truths, such as man's duty, how man should obey God, how man should be loyal to God, how man ought to live out normal humanity, as well as the wisdom and the disposition of God, and so on. These words are all directed at the substance of man and his corrupt disposition. In particular, the words that expose how man spurns God are spoken in regard to how man is an embodiment of Satan, and an enemy force against God. In undertaking his work of judgment, God does not simply make clear the nature of man with a few words, he exposes, deals with, and prunes over the long term. All these different methods of exposure, dealing, and pruning cannot be substituted with ordinary words, but with the truth of which man is utterly bereft. Only methods such as these can be called judgment, only through judgment of this kind can man be subdued and thoroughly convinced about God, and moreover gain true knowledge of God. What the work of judgment brings about is man's understanding of the true face of God and the truth about his own rebelliousness. The work of judgment allows man to gain much understanding of the will of God, of the purpose of God's work, and of the mysteries that are incomprehensible to him. It also allows man to recognize and know his corrupt essence and the roots of his corruption, as well as to discover the ugliness of man. These effects are all brought about by the work of judgment, for the essence of this work is actually the work of opening up the truth, the way, and the life of God to all those who have faith in him. This work is the work of judgment done by God. Today, it is because of your filth that I judge you, and it is because of your corruption and rebelliousness that I chastise you. I am not flaunting my power to you or deliberately oppressing you, I do these things because you, who have been born in this land of filth, have been so severely contaminated by filth. You have simply lost your integrity and humanity, and you have become like pigs born in the dirtiest corners of the world, and so it is because of this that you are judged and that I unleash my wrath upon you. It is precisely because of this judgment that you have been able to see that God is the righteous God, and that God is the holy God. It is precisely because of his holiness and his righteousness that he judges you and unleashes his wrath upon you. Because he can reveal his righteous disposition when he sees the rebelliousness of man, and because he can reveal his holiness when he sees the filth of man, this is enough to show that he is God himself, who is holy and pristine, and yet lives in the land of filth. If a person wallows in the mire with others, and there is nothing holy about him, and he has no righteous disposition, then he is not qualified to judge man's iniquity, nor is he fit to carry out the judgment of man. If a person were to judge another, would it not be as if they were slapping themselves in the face? How could people who are equally filthy as one another be qualified to judge those who are alike to them? Only the holy God himself is able to judge the whole of filthy mankind. How could man judge man's sins? How could man see the sins of man, and how could man be qualified to condemn these sins? If God were not qualified to judge the sins of man, then how could he be the righteous God himself? When people's corrupt dispositions are revealed, God speaks in order to judge people, and only then do people see that he is holy. For all of those who live in the flesh, changing their disposition requires goals to pursue, and knowing God requires witnessing the real deeds and the real face of God. Both can only be achieved by God's incarnate flesh, and both can only be accomplished by the normal and real flesh. This is why the Incarnation is necessary, and why it is needed by all corrupt mankind. Since people are required to know God, the images of the vague and supernatural gods must be dispelled from their hearts, and since they are required to cast off their corrupt disposition, they must first know their corrupt disposition. If only man does the work to dispel the images of the vague gods from people's hearts, then he will fail to achieve the proper effect. The images of the vague gods in people's hearts cannot be exposed, cast off, or completely expelled by words alone. In doing so, ultimately it would still not be possible to dispel these deep-rooted things from people. Only by replacing these vague and supernatural things with the practical God and the true image of God, and making people gradually know them, can the due effect be achieved. Man recognizes that the God whom he sought in times past is vague and supernatural. That which can achieve this effect is not the direct leadership of the Spirit, much less the teachings of a certain individual, but the incarnate God. The notions of man are laid bare when the incarnate God officially does his work, because the normality and reality of the incarnate God is the antithesis of the vague and supernatural God in man's imagination. The original notions of man can only be revealed when contrasted against the incarnate God. Without the comparison to the incarnate God, the notions of man could not be revealed. In other words, without reality as a foil, the vague things could not be revealed. No one is capable of using words to do this work, and no one is capable of articulating this work using words. Only God himself can do his own work, and no one else can do this work on his behalf. No matter how rich the language of man is, he is incapable of articulating the reality and normality of God. Man can only know God more practically, and can only see him more clearly, if God personally works among man and completely shows forth his image and his being. This effect cannot be achieved by any human being of flesh. It is precisely because Satan has corrupted the flesh of man, and man is the one who God intends to save, that God must assume the flesh to do battle with Satan and to personally shepherd man. Only this is beneficial to his work. The two incarnate fleshes of God have existed in order to defeat Satan, and also in order to better save man. That is because the one doing the battle with Satan can only be God, whether it be the Spirit of God or the incarnate flesh of God. In short, it cannot be the angels who are doing battle with Satan, much less can it be man, who has been corrupted by Satan. The angels are powerless to fight this battle, and man is even more impotent. As such, if God wishes to work the life of man, if he wishes to personally come to earth to save man, then he must personally become flesh, that is, he must personally assume the flesh, and with his inherent identity and the work that he must do, come among man and personally save man. If not, if it were the Spirit of God or man that did this work, then nothing would ever come of this battle, and it would never end. Only when God becomes flesh to personally go to war against Satan among man does man have a chance of salvation. Furthermore, only then is Satan shamed and left without any opportunities to exploit or any plans to execute. The work done by God incarnate is unachievable by the Spirit of God, and it would be even more impossible for any fleshly man to do it on God's behalf, for the work that he does is for the sake of the life of man, and in order to change the corrupt disposition of man. Were man to participate in this battle, he would only flee in woeful disarray, and would simply be incapable of changing his corrupt disposition. He would be incapable of saving man from the cross, or of conquering all of rebellious mankind, but would only be able to do a little old work that does not go beyond principles, or else work that is unrelated to the defeat of Satan. So why bother? What is the significance of work that cannot gain mankind, much less defeat Satan? And so, the battle with Satan can only be carried out by God himself, and it would simply be impossible for man to do it. Man's duty is to obey and to follow, for man is unable to do work akin to creating the heavens and earth, nor, moreover, can he carry out the work of battling Satan. Man can only satisfy the Creator under the leadership of God himself, through which Satan is defeated. This is the only thing that man can do. And so, every time a new battle commences, which is to say, every time the work of the new age begins, this work is personally done by God himself, through which he leads the entire age and opens up a new path for the whole of mankind. The work of God's entire management plan is personally done by God himself. The first stage, the creation of the world, was personally done by God himself, and if it had not been, then no one would have been capable of creating mankind. The second stage was the redemption of all mankind, and it was also personally done by God himself. The third stage goes without saying. There is an even greater need for the end of all God's work to be done by God himself. The work of redeeming, conquering, gaining, and perfecting the whole of mankind is all personally carried out by God himself. If he did not personally do this work, then his identity could not be represented by man, nor his work done by man. In order to defeat Satan, in order to gain mankind, and in order to give man a normal life on earth, he personally leads man and personally works among man, for the sake of his entire management plan, and for all of his work, he must personally do this work. If man only believes that God came so that man may see him, for the sake of making man happy, then such beliefs hold no value, no significance. Man's understanding is too superficial. Only by carrying this work out himself can God do this work thoroughly and completely. Man is incapable of doing it on behalf of God. As he does not have God's identity or his essence, he is incapable of doing God's work, and even if man did this work, it would not have any effect. The first time God became flesh was for the sake of redemption, to redeem all mankind from sin, to make man capable of being cleansed and of being forgiven for his sins. The work of conquest is also personally done by God among men. If, during this stage, God were only to speak prophecy, then a prophet or someone gifted could be found to take his place. If it were only prophecy being spoken, then man could stand in for God. Yet if man tried to personally do the work of God himself and tried to work the life of man, it would be impossible for him to do this work. It must be personally done by God himself. God must personally become flesh to do this work. In the age of word, if only prophecy were spoken, then Isaiah or Elijah the prophet could be found to do this work, and there would be no need for God himself to do it personally. Because the work done in this stage is not merely the speaking of prophecy, and because it is of greater importance that the work of words is used to conquer man and defeat Satan, this work cannot be done by man, and must be personally done by God himself. In the age of law, Jehovah did part of his work, after which he spoke some words and did some work through the prophets. That is because man could replace Jehovah in his work, and the seers could foretell things and interpret some dreams on his behalf. The work done in the beginning was not the work of directly changing man's disposition, and was unrelated to the sin of man, and man was required only to abide by the law. So Jehovah did not become flesh and reveal himself to man. Instead he spoke directly to Moses and others, made them speak and work on his behalf, and caused them to work directly among mankind. The first stage of God's work was the leadership of man. It was the start of the battle against Satan, but this battle had yet to officially begin. The official war against Satan began with the first incarnation of God, and it has continued right up until today. The first battle of this war was when God incarnate was nailed to the cross. The crucifixion of God incarnate defeated Satan. And it was the first successful stage in the war. When God incarnate began to directly work the life of man, this was the official start of the work of regaining man, and because this was the work of changing man's old disposition, it was the work of doing battle with Satan. The stage of work done by Jehovah in the beginning was merely the leadership of man's life on earth. It was the beginning of God's work, and although it had yet to involve any battle, or any major work, it laid the foundation for the work of the battle to come. Later, the second stage of work during the Age of Grace involved changing man's old disposition, which means that God Himself wrought the life of man. This had to be personally done by God. It required that God personally become flesh. If He had not become flesh, no one else could have replaced Him in this stage of work, for it represented the work of fighting directly against Satan. If man had done this work on God's behalf, when man stood before Satan, Satan would not have submitted and it would have been impossible to defeat it. It had to be God incarnate who came to defeat it. 4. The essence of God incarnate is still God, He is still the life of man, and He is still the Creator. Whatever happens, His identity and essence will not change. And so, He assumed the flesh and did the work to cause the complete submission of Satan. During the stage of work of the last days, if man were to do this work and were made to speak the words directly, then he would be unable to speak them, and if prophecy were spoken, then this prophecy would be incapable of conquering man. By assuming the flesh, God comes to defeat Satan and cause its complete submission. When He utterly defeats Satan, fully conquers man, and completely gains man, this stage of work will be completed and success achieved. In God's management, man cannot stand in for God. In particular, the work of leading the age and launching new work is in even greater need of being personally done by God Himself. Giving man revelation and providing him with prophecy can be done by man, but if it is work that must be personally done by God, work of the battle between God Himself and Satan, then this work cannot be done by man. During the first stage of work, when there was no battle with Satan, Jehovah personally led the people of Israel using the prophecy spoken by the prophets. Afterward, the second stage of work was the battle with Satan, and God Himself personally became flesh and came into the flesh to do this work. Anything that involves the battle against Satan also involves the incarnation of God, which means that this battle cannot be waged by man. If man were to do battle, he would be incapable of defeating Satan. How could he have the strength to fight against it whilst still under its domain? Man is in the middle. If you lean towards Satan, then you belong to Satan, but if you satisfy God, then you belong to God. Were man to try and stand in for God in the work of this battle, would he be able to? If he did, would he not have perished long ago? Would he not have entered into the netherworld long ago? So, man is unable to replace God in his work, which is to say that man does not have the essence of God, and if you did battle with Satan you would be incapable of defeating it. Man can only do some work, he can win some people over, but he cannot stand in for God in the work of God Himself. How could man do battle with Satan? Satan would take you captive before you had even started. Only when God Himself does battle with Satan and man follows and obeys God upon this basis, can man be gained by God and escape from the bonds of Satan. The things that man can achieve with his own wisdom and abilities are too limited. He is incapable of making man complete, of leading him, and, moreover, of defeating Satan. Man's intelligence and wisdom are unable to thwart the schemes of Satan, so how could man do battle with it? God is the beginning and the end. it is he himself who sets his work in motion, and so it must be he himself who concludes the former age. That is the proof of his defeat of Satan and of his conquest of the world. Each time he himself works among man, it is the start of a new battle. Without the beginning of new work, there would naturally be no conclusion of the old. And when there is no conclusion of the old, this is proof that the battle with Satan is yet to come to an end. Only if God himself comes, and carries out new work among man, can man break completely free of the domain of Satan and gain a new life and a new beginning. Otherwise, man shall forever live in the old age and forever live under the old influence of Satan. With every age led by God, a part of man is set free, and thus man advances along with the work of God toward the new age. The victory of God means a victory for all those who follow him. If the race of created human beings were charged with concluding the age, then be it from the viewpoint of man or of Satan, this would be no more than an act of opposing or betraying God, not one of obedience to God, and the work of man would become a tool for Satan. Only if man obeys and follows God in an age ushered in by God himself can Satan be fully convinced, for that is the duty of a created being. Therefore, I say that you need only follow and obey, and no more is required of you. This is what is meant by each keeping to his duty and each performing his respective function. God does his own work and has no need for man to do it in his stead, nor does he participate in the work of created beings. Man performs his own duty and does not participate in the work of God. Only this is obedience, and proof of Satan's defeat. After God himself has finished ushering in the new age, he no longer comes down to work in the midst of mankind himself. It is only then that man officially steps into the new age to perform his duty and carry out his mission as a created being. These are the principles by which God works, which no one may transgress. Only working in this way is sensible and reasonable. The work of God is to be done by God himself. It is he who sets his work in motion, and it is he who concludes his work. It is he who plans the work, and it is he who manages it, and even more, it is he who brings the work to fruition. As stated in the Bible, I am the beginning and the end, I am the sower and the reaper. All that pertains to the work of his management is done by God himself. He is the ruler of the 6,000 year management plan. No one can do his work in his stead, and no one can bring his work to a close, for it is he who holds everything in his hand. Having created the world, he will lead the entire world to live in his light, and he will also conclude the entire age, thereby bringing his entire plan to fruition. Thank you for listening. May God bless you.